In 1945, the war in the Pacific no longer depended solely on a new weapon. Behind the atomic bombs was a much broader conflict: an exhausted country, an army determined to resist, and an allied strategy based on blockade and air superiority. Between January and August of that year, Japan tried to maintain its empire while more than 1,500 American aircraft carriers, ships, and submarines closed the ring from all fronts. In Tokyo, the High Command organized the defense with the last available resources, and from the north, the Soviet threat approached with over 1 million soldiers. The Allies were deciphering messages, calculating losses, and finalizing the invasion of the archipelago. At the center of the crisis was Emperor Hirohito, pressured by generals and diplomats who understood that the end was near. This is how the final phase of the conflict began, a desperate struggle to avoid the disappearance of the Japanese Empire. How could an entire nation reach this point of no return? Japan entered the war as a military power with global ambitions, but with a limited material base from the very beginning. The country was an archipelago with scarce natural resources and an industry that depended on external inputs to sustain its production. Unlike other industrial powers, it did not have large reserves of strategic raw materials or a production system capable of scaling up quickly in the event of a prolonged conflict. This structural condition marked the development of its entire war economy and conditioned every subsequent decision. In industrial terms, the difference with the United States was overwhelming. The American economy had a huge, diversified, and highly mechanized industrial base capable of mass-producing both civilian and military goods. American factories could quickly switch from producing cars to tanks, from household appliances to airplanes, without having to completely redesign their processes. This flexibility did not exist in Japan, where production was fragmented, less standardized, and largely dependent on manual labor. Shipbuilding is a clear example of this gap. Japan had modern shipyards and skilled technicians, but its total capacity was limited. Each ship required large amounts of steel, specialized labor, and manufacturing time. In the United States, shipyards operated with mass production methods, using standardized parts that allowed ships to be assembled at a constant rate. While Japan needed long periods to complete a single unit, the American industry could launch several ships in the same period. The aviation industry showed a similar difference. Japan had developed advanced aircraft for its time, light and with good initial performance, but production was slow and uneven. Each model required constant adjustments, and standards were not always maintained consistently between different factories. In contrast, the United States produced aircraft on mass assembly lines with interchangeable components and uniform quality control. This facilitated not only production, but also maintenance and repair in the operational field. The production of ground weapons followed the same pattern. Japan could manufacture rifles, artillery, and ammunition in sufficient quantities for limited campaigns, but not for a prolonged war against a larger industrial power. Factories were not prepared for sudden increases in demand or for quickly replenishing losses. The United States, on the other hand, had production capacity that far exceeded its initial needs, allowing it to supply both its own forces and those of its allies at the same time. One of the most critical factors was the capacity for replacement. Japan trained its pilots, technicians, and specialists over long periods with high standards but in reduced numbers. Every loss represented a hard blow to compensate for. The industry could not produce enough new aircraft at the required pace, nor could the training system generate replacements quickly enough. In the United States, training programs were designed to produce large volumes of skilled personnel, even if individual quality varied, ensuring continuous operational capacity. The conversion of civilian industry to military production was also a key difference. In the United States, large civilian companies were quickly integrated into the war effort, using existing machinery and already trained personnel. The financial and administrative system facilitated this transition through massive contracts and centralized planning. In Japan, although there was state coordination, the scale of the economy limited the impact of these measures. There were not enough plants or resources to sustain a similar expansion. In terms of technology, Japan began the war with comparable levels in some areas, but lacked the capacity to maintain that pace. The development and implementation of new technologies required constant investment, specific materials, and a broad scientific base. The United States had universities, laboratories, and research centers integrated into the war effort, capable of continuously developing and applying innovations. Japan had technical talent but lacked the same infrastructure and volume of resources. The use of radar is a representative example. The technology existed and was known, but its adoption was uneven and limited. Production of equipment was small, and integration into defense systems advanced slowly. In the United States, radar was systematically incorporated, mass-produced, with standardized training and coordinated application in various fields. This difference was not just due to technical knowledge, but to the industrial capacity to manufacture, distribute, and maintain the equipment. Modern logistics relied on this same material base. Transporting, storing, and distributing supplies required vehicles, infrastructure, and efficient administrative systems. The American industry could produce trucks, trains, spare parts, and auxiliary equipment in large quantities, ensuring the continuous functioning of its forces. Japan, with more limited resources, had to constantly prioritize which sectors to supply, leaving others with chronic shortages. Training was also conditioned by industry. The availability of fuel, spare parts, and training equipment directly influenced personnel preparation. The United States could sustain long and massive training programs, while Japan faced restrictions that affected the regularity and intensity of these processes even before the conflict reached its most critical point. Together, these differences show that Japan did not enter the war from a position of material equality. Its economy was not designed for a prolonged conflict against a large industrial power. Every aircraft, every ship, and every piece of weaponry represented a considerable effort, difficult to repeat in large numbers. In the face of an industry capable of continuous and growing production, this structural limitation shaped the course of the conflict from the very beginning, before a single decisive battle was fought. Pearl Harbor, the blow that awakened a giant. In the months leading up to the war, the Japanese government and high command debated a single issue: how to obtain the resources the country needed before the economic blockade left it with no margin. The sanctions imposed by the United States and the oil embargo had drastically reduced supplies. The military saw time running out. In Tokyo, reports spoke of reserves sufficient only for a couple of years, and the Navy warned that without fuel, there would be no operational fleet. While diplomats tried to negotiate, the most influential officers insisted there was no peaceful way out. Prime Minister Kono sought an agreement with Washington, but the conditions were incompatible with imperial objectives. The army would not accept withdrawing forces from China or abandoning the recent conquests in Indochina. Meanwhile, the Navy General Staff, led by Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, developed a risky plan to preemptively attack the US fleet in Hawaii to neutralize it from the start. Yamamoto, a veteran with experience in the United States, knew that American industrial superiority was enormous, but he believed that a swift blow could buy time and demoralize the enemy before they could deploy their full power. In the fall of 1941, meetings of the Imperial Council became tense. Some civilian officials warned that a large-scale attack on such a great power was a suicidal gamble. However, the dominant thinking within the military revolved around the idea of a decisive blow. If the Navy could destroy the aircraft carriers and battleships at Pearl Harbor, the country would have months of freedom to consolidate its expansion in Southeast Asia and secure access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. This window of time was considered vital. On November 3rd, Emperor Hirohito approved the general directive to prepare for war. In the following days, Japanese planners developed an operation that required unprecedented coordination. The attacking fleet would be organized into 6 main aircraft carriers, accompanied by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. From the cold waters of the northern Pacific, the force would advance in silence without emitting radio signals. Each plane, torpedo, and bomb was assigned with precision. The officers knew that the element of surprise was critical. While the pilots trained in Kagoshima Bay, models of the Pearl Harbor base were built to practice approach and attack angles. The torpedoes were modified to operate in shallow waters, and perforating bombs capable of piercing battleship decks were designed. The preparation was meticulous. Despite the secrecy, there was division within the general staff. Some believed the attack would trigger a war that was impossible to win. Still, the consensus was that there was no alternative. Either action was taken immediately, or the country would be slowly strangled by the embargo. On November 26, 1941, the fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo set sail from Hitokapu Bay, heading east. It consisted of more than 30 ships and over 350 aircraft. The weather conditions worked in their favor, concealing their advance. At 7:48 a.m. on December 7th, the first wave appeared over Oahu. In a few minutes, Japanese pilots launched torpedoes and bombs on the anchored ships. The explosions shook the harbor, and columns of smoke rose over the Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia battleships. The attack was carried out with precision. In less than 2 hours, 8 battleships were either sunk or damaged, along with several cruisers, destroyers, and more than 180 aircraft on the ground. About 2,400 people were killed. The Pacific Fleet was temporarily rendered combat ineffective. From a tactical standpoint, the operation was an immediate success. However, the political and strategic consequences were the opposite of what Tokyo had expected. Yamamoto had warned that an initial blow would not be enough. In one of his most remembered quotes, he expressed that if a decisive victory was not achieved in the first months, the country would face a long and impossible war. The American reaction surpassed any Japanese calculation. The attack, intended to demoralize, had the opposite effect. It unified public opinion, eliminated internal divisions, and created a total commitment to the war. On December 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress with his speech about the Day of Infamy. In less than an hour, the United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy did the same, fulfilling the Tripartite Pact. The conflict officially became a total world war. In the following days, the US government approved an unprecedented mobilization, coordinating industry, the military, and public opinion. In the weeks that followed, Japan advanced rapidly in the Pacific. It occupied Guam, Hong Kong, Manila, and much of Southeast Asia. The General Staff presented these achievements as proof that the preemptive offensive had been correct. However, each conquest expanded supply lines and required more resources to defend scattered territories. The apparent expansion was, in reality, an increasing commitment. Diplomatically, the attack closed any possibility for negotiation. Until then, there was the idea that the conflict in Asia could be resolved through concessions. After December 7th, that option disappeared. The attack without a declaration of war was seen as a betrayal. The Allied powers, which had differences over priorities, found in Pearl Harbor a unifying point. Great Britain, Australia, China, and the United States coordinated strategies and resources. In Tokyo, the War Cabinet interpreted the rapid American mobilization as proof of the effectiveness of the initial blow. It was expected that the enemy's reaction would be strong but delayed. However, events showed the opposite. The American response was immediate, coordinated, and sustained. The tactical surprise turned into a strategic disaster. Japanese intelligence had underestimated how quickly the enemy could replace losses. They also ignored the emotional impact of the attack. Instead of sowing fear, Pearl Harbor generated a determination that united 130 million Americans around a single goal: to defeat Japan. In this atmosphere, Japanese diplomacy in Washington was nullified. Ambassadors Nomura and Kurusu delivered the note of rupture too late, minutes after the bombing. This reinforced the perception of deliberate deceit. Internally, the initial victory fueled the confidence of the high command. Speeches about the destiny of the empire and the inevitability of victory multiplied. Images of the attack were used to promote the spirit of national sacrifice. However, within Yamamoto's circle, concerns persisted. The blow had been spectacular but not decisive, and the time gained might prove insufficient if the conflict dragged on. In the first months of 1942, the Japanese population lived in euphoria. Official reports announced victories in Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. It seemed that the strategy of the preemptive blow had worked. But at the Navy Ministry offices, reports were read with concern. American aircraft carriers continued to operate and conducted incursions into the Central Pacific. Analysts warned that the enemy was reorganizing quickly, and its industrial capacity was starting to make an unmatchable difference. In Tokyo, some commanders understood that the attack on Pearl Harbor had solved nothing. What was supposed to be a decisive blow had only awakened a more powerful adversary. In less than a day, Japan had gone from seeking a diplomatic solution to facing a completely mobilized nation with an expanding industry and a population determined to resist. That attack, planned as a maneuver to buy time, ended up sealing the beginning of a war without return. Midway. 4 aircraft carriers and the end of Japanese supremacy. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy believed it had neutralized the Pacific Fleet. In the following months, its forces expanded throughout the ocean, occupying islands and bases from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean. This chain of victories reinforced the idea that the enemy would take years to recover. However, the officers closest to Yamamoto Isoroku knew that time was working against Japan. Each operation moved the fleet further from its support centers and wore out its best-trained pilots. Yamamoto's plan for 1942 aimed to eliminate the threat posed by the American aircraft carriers that had survived Pearl Harbor. He considered it essential to provoke a decisive battle that would destroy the remnants of the enemy fleet before its industry could make up for the initial losses. The chosen location was Midway, a small atoll north of Hawaii, considered the eastern gateway to the Pacific. The idea was to lure the American aircraft carriers with an invasion of the island, force them to respond, and then destroy them with the main force of Kido Butai. The operation was planned with the usual complexity of the Japanese Navy staff. The fleet was divided into several groups that would operate at great distances from each other. The main force under Yamamoto, the aircraft carrier force under the command of Chuichi Nagumo, an occupation force to take the island, and another to cover the north, heading toward the Aleutians. On paper, this appeared to be an enveloping maneuver. In practice, it scattered forces that could have been concentrated. Intelligence reports from Tokyo indicated that the United States could only muster 2 or 3 aircraft carriers, which led to a dangerous overconfidence. The Japanese were unaware that their JN-25 code system had been partially deciphered. Thanks to this, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew in advance the date and target of the attack. In Pearl Harbor, American intelligence had verified that AF, the code assigned by the Japanese, referred to Midway. The Japanese plan called for an initial bombing of the base, followed by a troop landing. Nagumo's force, consisting of the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, set out from Japan with 248 aircraft on board. They were accompanied by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 12 destroyers. At midnight on June 3, 1942, the Japanese fleet approached the atoll, unaware that it was being watched. American reconnaissance planes took off before dawn from Midway and detected the enemy formations more than 700 miles away. Nimitz ordered an ambush to be set up. The aircraft carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown positioned themselves to the northeast of the island, out of visual range of the Japanese. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, the first Japanese wave took off to bomb the facilities. The Zero fighters flew in support, while the dive bombers and torpedo bombers aimed at the runways and fuel tanks. The defense of the island was fierce. Of the 27 Buffalo and Wildcat fighters that took off, most were destroyed, but they managed to scatter part of the attack. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who was sick and absent from the flight, was directing operations from the bridge of the Akagi. When the first wave returned, the pilots reported that a second bombing would be necessary to completely destroy the base. Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had to decide whether to launch another land attack or keep the planes armed with torpedoes in case of an enemy fleet. At 7:15, he ordered part of the planes to be rearmed. A few minutes later, he received a message from a reconnaissance plane reporting the presence of American ships to the east. The admiral halted the process and ordered the planes to be rearmed with torpedoes. The delay on the flight deck proved fatal. The hangars were full of fuel, bombs, and ammunition when Nimitz's planes approached. From the north, torpedo bombers from the Hornet and Enterprise attempted to attack without escort. They flew at low altitude and were decimated by the Japanese fighters. Of the 41 Devastator planes that took part, almost none returned. However, this sacrifice forced the Zero fighters to descend, disrupting the cover. At 10:20 a.m., 3 groups of dauntless dive bombers located the Japanese aircraft carriers. In a matter of minutes, they dropped their bombs from high altitude. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit almost simultaneously. Explosions tore through the decks filled with fuel, and the fires spread uncontrollably. In less than 10 minutes, 3 of the 4 aircraft carriers were put out of action. The fires destroyed the hangars and killed hundreds of pilots and technicians. Nagumo himself moved his flag to the Nagata Maru before ordering a temporary retreat. The Hiryu, the only remaining operational aircraft carrier, launched 2 successive attacks, which struck the Yorktown. 2 bombs and a torpedo immobilized it. The crews managed to extinguish the fires, but a second blow sank it the following day. The revenge was short. In the afternoon, new dauntless dive bombers found the Hiryu and attacked. 4 direct hits turned it into a torch on the sea. By nightfall, the Japanese fleet was retreating, leaving 4 aircraft carriers destroyed and over 250 aircraft lost. The disaster was total. In less than 1 day, the Imperial Navy had lost half of its most valuable aircraft carriers, and with them, most of its experienced pilots. The final numbers spoke for themselves. More than 3,000 men dead, 4 aircraft carriers sunk, 1 cruiser lost, and only a few hundred intact planes. The Americans, though damaged, retained control of the seas. Yamamoto, still hundreds of miles away with the main force, considered sending his battleships into battle, but confused communications and fear of a new ambush made him abandon the idea. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, he ordered a general retreat. The offensive against Midway had failed. The invasion was cancelled, and the troops intended to occupy the island returned without having fired a single shot. In Tokyo, the impact was immediate. The authorities tried to conceal the magnitude of the disaster, but rumors quickly spread among the commanders. Official communications spoke of heavy losses, without mentioning that the sunk ships were the core of the Kido Butai, the very force that had dominated the Pacific since 1941. Confidence in the invincibility of the Imperial Navy was completely shattered. The defeat revealed doctrinal errors that had accumulated over the years. The Japanese command system was too rigid. Decisions were made by consensus among officers of equal rank, which delayed reactions in the heat of battle. The excessive division of the fleet, limited use of reconnaissance, and the lack of effective radar systems exposed the vulnerabilities of the traditional approach. The Americans, in contrast, had learned to coordinate aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines in a flexible network. Tactically, Midway confirmed the supremacy of the aircraft carrier over the battleship. The great artillery ships, symbols of Japan's naval power, had lost their purpose. From that day forward, the war in the Pacific would be decided in the air. But for Japan, the loss of its aviators was devastating. In a single day, the core of the pilots who had sustained operations from China to the Coral Sea vanished, leaving the Navy without a generation capable of conducting air warfare. The strategic consequences became clear in the following months. With the Kido Butai destroyed, Japan went on the defensive. The Navy never regained the initiative. The remaining forces focused on holding positions in the South Pacific, while the United States began its advance toward the Solomon Islands. From then on, every battle demanded more resources than the empire could provide. Without fuel, no empire. Japan ran out of war. From the first months of the war, Japan's central problem was energy supply. In 1941, more than 80% of the oil consumed by the country came from abroad, primarily from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. This fuel was essential to keep the fleet, aviation, and heavy industry operational. When Washington imposed the total embargo, the Japanese military system entered an immediate countdown. Even the subsequent expansion into Southeast Asia did not reverse the situation, as distances, damage to facilities, and transportation difficulties prevented these conquests from becoming a stable supply source. Reports from the Ministry of Commerce showed that even during military expansion, Japan depended on long and vulnerable routes. Coal came from Korea and Manchuria, iron from China and Malaysia, rubber from the Indonesian archipelago. Almost everything had to be transported by sea in slow convoys. The refineries in Yokohama and Osaka could only process a fraction of the crude oil needed for the Imperial Navy. In comparison, the United States had more than 100 million tons of domestic production per year, with refineries connected by pipelines and railroads covering the entire country. The Japanese Admiralty had calculated before Pearl Harbor that without new sources, the reserves would last only 18 months. The initial success in the South Pacific gave them access to Borneo, Sumatra, and Java, regions rich in oil, but the facilities were damaged and transportation was nearly impossible. In Java, for example, only 1/3 of the wells could operate after Allied sabotage. Tankers were scarce, and each return trip to Japan required crossing thousands of miles under US aerial surveillance. The imperial economy attempted to reorganize. In Tokyo, the Ministry of the Navy created the Fuel Office to centralize distribution. The armed forces had absolute priority, leaving the rest of the country with severe rationing. Synthetic fuels were mixed with natural gasoline, liquefied coal and vegetable oils were experimented with, but the production of substitutes was minimal. According to reports from 1943, only 7% of total consumption came from synthetic fuels, while the Army's needs continued to increase. In factories, the shortage of raw materials became critical. Steel depended on shipments of iron from Anshan and imported scrap. The routes linking Manchuria to mainland Japan were congested, and the lack of coke reduced the efficiency of blast furnaces. To compensate, the government promoted the recycling of metals. Railings, bells, and household items were melted down to make shells. Even so, industrial production in 1944 fell by more than 30% compared to 1942. Engineers tried to keep production going with local resources. In Hokkaido, low-quality oil wells were drilled and coal mining was expanded, but internal logistics were insufficient. The railway network was overloaded with military transports. In many plants, electricity was cut off for hours due to a lack of fuel. Official statistics from 1944 showed a general decline in electricity production and the supply of steel, aluminum, and copper. The Allied blockade turned the shortage into suffocation. Sea routes from the south were drastically reduced. The merchant fleet, which in 1941 had almost 6 million tons, lost more than half in 2 years. Each ship sunk meant fewer raw materials and fewer food supplies. Factories began to close entire shifts. The internal transport system increasingly relied on low-quality coal mined in the north, which was insufficient to keep trains and plants running. At military academies, instructors reduced flight hours. Inexperienced pilots practiced on gliders or planes without enough fuel for real missions. Reports from the air staff in 1944 acknowledged that the lack of aviation gasoline prevented the continuation of training programs. The result was a decline in crew quality, which directly affected combat performance. The same problem reached the Navy. Large aircraft carriers and battleships remained docked in ports to save fuel. They were only mobilized when the situation was critical. Escort patrols were reduced, and the number of naval exercises fell to symbolic levels. Even the convoys carrying essential materials to mainland Japan sailed with less protection. The government tried to impose total resource management. Organizations like the Planning Agency and the Rationing Office were created to distribute every ton of steel and every liter of fuel. Local authorities organized campaigns to collect metals, rubber, and used clothing. Schools taught children to grow gardens and recycle materials. However, the figures from the Imperial Economic Council indicated that strategic reserves were depleting faster than expected. In 1944, crude oil production in the occupied Dutch East Indies did not exceed 2 million tons annually, less than a quarter of Japan's pre-war consumption. Of that volume, less than 40% actually reached national ports. Losses due to sinkings and sabotage meant that much of the oil never left the depots. Attempts to transport crude oil in smaller ships or hide the convoys under the cover of storms did not change the outcome. The effect of the blockade was not limited to oil. Aluminum, essential for airplanes, became scarce in 1943. The loss of mines in the South Pacific cut the supply of bauxite, and domestic production was insufficient. As a result, aircraft production was reduced by half. Workshops improvised with wood and lightweight materials to keep up the pace, but the results were poor. The same crisis affected copper, rubber, and fertilizers. The lack of the latter reduced harvests, worsening the food situation. In 1944, rural authorities reported that rice production had fallen by almost 20% compared to previous years. Military transports absorbed most of the available wagons, leaving urban areas with minimal supplies. The economic system entered a vicious cycle. Less fuel meant less transportation, which in turn made it difficult to move coal and raw materials to factories. Each section of the chain weakened. Ships without fuel oil remained anchored, trains without coal stopped, and factories without energy shut down furnaces and turbines. By 1945, Japanese industrial production had reverted to levels of the early 1930s. At the end of 1944, the High Command officially recognized that the energy supply situation was unsustainable. Aviation fuel reserves covered less than 2 months of operations. Reports sent to the Cabinet by the Economic Planning Office indicated that steel production had fallen to less than half, and maritime transport operated with less than 30% of its initial capacity. Without fuel, no strategy could be sustained. Material suffocation had reached an irreversible point. Japan no longer had the margin to sustain prolonged campaigns or train new forces. The fleet and aviation were, in practice, immobilized. The war that began with the search for resources ended precisely due to their lack. The U.S. submarine blockade, killing without being seen. Since 1942, the war in the Pacific slowly began to turn against Japan. After Midway, the Imperial Navy had lost the initiative, but the deepest blow did not come from the air, but from the depths of the sea. U.S. submarines launched a silent, constant, and devastating campaign that would eventually sever the economic arteries of the empire. In the first months, the U.S. submarine effort faced limitations. The Mark 14 torpedoes, equipped with defective fuses, exploded erratically or did not detonate at all. For nearly a year, the effectiveness of the attacks was minimal. However, by the end of 1943, the technical failures were fixed, and the submarine fleet began to operate with full effectiveness. From that moment on, each mission became a methodical hunt against Japanese merchant ships that maintained the flow of oil, food, and raw materials to the archipelago. Japan entered the war with a merchant fleet of nearly 6 million gross tons. This capacity was the foundation of its economy. Through these routes, shipments of rubber from Malaya, coal from Manchuria, and oil from the Dutch East Indies were transported. The U.S. submarines, organized into flotillas that departed from Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Brisbane, were ordered to destroy any ship that supported the Empire's structure. Unlike the Atlantic, where convoy rules applied from the beginning, Japan lacked a coherent anti-submarine defense. Their escorts were few, their sonar detectors primitive, and their tactics rigid. Captain John Wilkes, commanding the Pacific Submarine Fleet, implemented a layered blockade strategy. The first submarines operated near the Philippines. Behind them, others covered the South China Sea and the routes to metropolitan Japan. In 1943, statistics began to show the final turning point of the war at sea. That year, over 1.5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping were sunk, an unprecedented number. The scale of the offensive was such that a single submarine could destroy, in one patrol, a volume of traffic equivalent to an entire port for a month. The USS Wahoo, under the command of Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, became one of the symbols of this campaign. In successive missions in the Yellow Sea, it sank over 90,000 tons of ships. During the same period, the USS Harder operated off Borneo, attacking escorts and destroying tankers loaded with crude oil. As the war progressed, coordination between intelligence and patrols improved. The Americans used the ultra-decryption system to learn the routes of the convoys. Information gathered in Hawaii allowed commanders to position themselves precisely at transit points. On Admiral Charles Lockwood's maps, the most active routes were marked in red. Each week, new sinkings were added. The impact on Japanese supply was immediate. By the end of 1943, the Ministry of the Navy acknowledged losses of 35% of its merchant tonnage. In 1944, the figure exceeded 50%. The Tokuyama and Yokkaichi refineries were operating at less than half capacity due to a lack of crude oil. Military reports described paralyzed ports and rows of ships immobile due to a fuel shortage. The General Staff itself admitted that the submarine war was more damaging than any bombing. The routes connecting the Dutch East Indies with Japan became a death corridor. In the Makassar Strait, in the South China Sea, and off Luzon, U.S. submarines attacked relentlessly. Japanese crews called them Kaitei Sensuikan no Oni, the demons of the deep sea. To attempt to contain the catastrophe, Japan created the Convoy Escort Command, a naval escort force, but the shortage of ships and the priority given to aircraft carriers left most merchant ships without real protection. Old destroyers were converted into escorts, and fishing boats were armed with light cannons, but without modern radar or sonar, they were easy targets. Losses continued to rise. In 1944, U.S. submarines sank over 3 million tons of shipping. The USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, managed to destroy 13 ships in a single patrol before being hit by its own torpedo. Another, the USS Flasher, set a record of 100,000 tons in 4 months. These figures represented not only tactical successes, but also the systematic destruction of the Japanese economy. The consequences were reflected in every sector. Aviation fuel fell to critical levels. Naval units reduced training to a minimum. In factories, a lack of raw materials halted production. Internal routes were fragmented, and communication between the islands of the empire became irregular. Food began to run out in cities. In Tokyo and Osaka, supply reports indicated that rice arrived weeks late. The General Staff tried to improvise solutions. It was ordered to build transport submarines to carry oil and rubber from Southeast Asia, but only a few managed to complete their voyages. Barges and small ships were also used, traveling at night to avoid detection, but losses continued. In the final months of 1944, convoys were reduced to scattered groups, and many ships traveled alone, further increasing the risk. At the same time, U.S. submarines perfected their methods. They operated in wolf packs, coordinated by radio, intercepting large convoys. Nighttime attacks were the deadliest. The Mark 18 electric torpedoes left few traces in the water, making it nearly impossible to detect them in time. The most experienced captains applied simultaneous maneuvers, While one launched torpedoes from the bow, another did so from the stern, trapping the merchant ships in a crossfire. By early 1945, the effect of the submarine blockade was absolute. From the original merchant fleet, only a fraction remained usable. According to Admiral Lockwood's calculations, Japan had only 1 million tons of navigable ships left, many of which were damaged or immobilized due to a lack of fuel. Oil imports had fallen by more than 90%. Coastal traffic, which moved food and coal, had practically disappeared. The economic reports of the Japanese government confirmed the collapse. The steel mills of Yawata and Kobe were operating at less than a third of their capacity. The supply of bauxite and rubber from Southeast Asia had been interrupted. The reserves of wheat, salt, and dried fish were insufficient. The authorities imposed extreme rationing and urban farming campaigns, but production could not compensate for the loss of maritime transport. The impact was also psychological. Convoy crews knew that few would survive. Sailors named some routes death routes. Morale plummeted and civilian captains began to refuse voyages. The official press avoided publishing figures, but the population noticed the emptiness. Fewer trains, fewer ships, fewer products. American commanders considered that the submarine war had achieved what aviation had only just begun, the complete isolation of the archipelago. By the summer of 1945, submarines were patrolling even off the coasts of Honshu and Shikoku. The charred remains of merchant ships were visible from the shore. The country, deprived of fuel and raw materials, was paralyzed. Lost skies, Allied naval air superiority. By early 1943, the map of the Pacific began to shift. The Japanese advance line stopped, and US forces began to reclaim territory step by step. What had once been expansion now turned into defense, and the air and the sea, which had been symbols of imperial power, became lost territory. The change was first noticed in the skies. In the Solomons and New Guinea, Japanese pilots continued to fight skillfully, but the losses became impossible to replace. Accelerated training drastically reduced the quality of new crews. In 1942, a Navy aviator received over 700 flight hours before being sent into combat. 2 years later, it was barely 150. The Zero fighters, which had dominated the first months, were left behind by new US models such as the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. Allied intelligence reports indicated that for every American plane shot down in 1944, Japan lost more than 10. At sea, the technological gap widened just as quickly. The United States launched a massive naval construction program. Every month, new aircraft carriers, destroyers, and anti-submarine escorts equipped with radar were leaving its shipyards. The Imperial Navy could not compete. After Midway and the Coral Sea, its losses mounted. The aircraft carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho were lost in the 1944 battles, and their replacements were hastily built, smaller versions with far less operational capacity. Air superiority now defined the war. The Japanese Air Force, which had once struck accurately at Pearl Harbor and Singapore, was forced to fly defensive missions from improvised airstrips. Airfields in Rabaul, Truk, and Saipan became fixed targets. US bombers attacked day and night, and Japanese fighters could no longer stop them. The early warning network was minimal, and radar imported from Germany was never produced in sufficient quantity. In 1943, Rabaul was still considered the Gibraltar of the South Pacific. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and pilots defended their airstrips. But when the Americans began massive attacks from the Solomons, the base was isolated and bombed until it was unusable. Japanese reports spoke of more than 500 aircraft destroyed on the ground or in the air. The Imperial Air Force lost its best personnel there. From that point on, fortified islands that had once been strongholds became traps where the enemy dominated the air. Communications deteriorated at the same speed. Ships carrying supplies or troops could no longer sail without escort, and the daily losses forced a reduction in traffic. In 1944, when the Allied offensive reached the Marianas, the Japanese Navy could barely gather enough fuel for a few days of operations. On Saipan, American planes destroyed more than 200 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The so-called Battle of the Philippine Sea was described by Japanese sailors as a slaughter. The inexperienced pilots took off without real combat training and were shot down in large numbers before they even reached their targets. The situation at sea was just as desperate. The US fleet, supported by a logistical system that ensured fuel and spare parts at any point in the ocean, advanced at a pace that Japan could not follow. In the summer of 1944, US naval units had more than a dozen aircraft carriers and hundreds of support ships. The Empire, on the other hand, fought with the remnants of its fleet. The battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte marked the final collapse of Japanese naval power. At Leyte, the ships Yamato, Musashi, Zuikaku, and Chikuma were sunk or damaged beyond repair. US technicians had managed to integrate radar information with codebreaker calculations, allowing them to anticipate enemy movements with hours of advantage. According to Central Pacific intelligence records, most Japanese attacks were detected before the pilots even reached strike range. Interception orders could be issued almost in real time while the enemy air force was still en route. Allied air superiority had a direct impact on ground operations. In New Guinea, Burma, and the Philippines, Japanese columns moved only at night. During the day, any vehicle detected was targeted by fighters or bombers. The army lost the ability to move reinforcements by sea or air. Thousands of soldiers were trapped on islands without support. The supply routes, already limited by fuel shortages, were completely cut off. On the naval front, technological superiority expanded with the use of airborne and surface search radar. US destroyers could detect targets miles away, even in darkness. The Japanese fleet, by contrast, continued to rely on spotters and optical rangefinders. In the night battles of the Solomons and the Philippine Sea, this difference was decisive. Japanese cruisers and destroyers were hit without having even located the enemy. The numbers reflect this. Between 1942 and 1945, Japan lost more than 400 major warships, including 16 aircraft carriers and more than 40 cruisers. The Americans, during the same period, replaced each loss with new and better-equipped units. In 1945, while the Japanese fleet hid in ports without fuel, the United States deployed carrier strike groups operating continuously off the coasts of Japan. The Japanese defensive network, based on rings of fortified islands, collapsed. Without air or naval control, each point in the perimeter became isolated. Reports from the Japanese Navy in 1944 acknowledged that it was impossible to hold the positions at Truk, Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines simultaneously. Communications between commands broke down and many garrisons were cut off for months. The sinking of the Musashi symbolized the end of an era. At over 70,000 tons, it was one of the largest ships ever built. It was attacked by waves of American aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea. More than a dozen bombs and torpedoes split it in two. Despite its size and armor, its sinking demonstrated that no battleship could withstand modern air power. From that point on, Japanese ships avoided direct confrontations. Meanwhile, the Allied air forces transformed the space of the Pacific. Air bases advanced with each conquest. On Tinian and Guam, runways capable of receiving B-29 bombers were built, allowing them to fly to Japan's main islands. Japanese aviation could barely intercept them. The Zero fighters, obsolete and scarce, could not reach the height or speed of enemy bombers. Combat losses multiplied. In less than a year, Japan lost control of the skies. The deterioration of naval dominance was equally visible. The commercial routes connecting the archipelago to occupied colonies were empty. The convoys carrying coal, food, and materials were barely organized. US submarines patrolled all the major routes, and Allied aircraft carriers extended their strike radius to the Japanese coasts. In 1945, the combined fleet itself was reduced to symbolic movements. The inability to defend Japanese cities was a direct consequence of this loss of control. With airfields destroyed and aviation exhausted, the airspace was wide open. Early warning radars did not cover the entire territory, and anti-aircraft batteries were few. The major cities were exposed to continuous air attacks, which would soon intensify. In this way, the Pacific, which in 1941 had been the stage for imperial expansion, became an impossible frontier. The air and the sea, once under Japanese control, now belonged to the enemy. And without control of either, the defense of the home territory became an illusion. The dogma of death: obey until disappearance. From the early years of the war, the Japanese military mindset was shaped by a code that exalted absolute obedience and self-sacrifice. The Army and Navy shared the belief that death for the homeland was the highest form of service. Military schools taught that surrender was a disgrace and that courage was measured not by victory, but by the willingness to die. This thinking, inherited from Bushido, permeated all levels of command and turned war into an almost religious act. The campaigns in China and Southeast Asia reinforced this view. Mid-level officers, hardened in scenarios of extreme violence, learned to despise human life. In Nanking, Manila, or Burma, officers insisted that compassion was a Western weakness. In war reports, expressions like purifying the enemy were used instead of killing him. This rhetoric displayed a mental structure where brutality was seen as proof of loyalty. As the war progressed, this mindset became a trap. The general staff refused to accept retreats, even when positions were untenable. On Guadalcanal, division commanders were ordered to resist with no hope of reinforcements. The units were decimated until they disappeared. Official instructions repeated that no soldier should return alive if the position fell. On Saipan, in the summer of 1944, this doctrine reached its extreme point. When the Japanese lines collapsed before the American advance, officers distributed grenades among the civilians and ordered them to commit suicide before being captured. On the cliffs of Marpi Point, hundreds of people, including children, jumped into the void shouting "Tenno Haika Banzai." Army reports recorded those acts as honorable deaths without mentioning the despair that triggered them. This logic was not limited to the battlefield. State propaganda presented the war as a moral and spiritual crusade. The enemy was not just military, but racial, and absolute sacrifice was justified as a historical duty. In this context, any doubt was seen as betrayal. Indoctrination directly influenced strategic decision-making. At high command meetings, dissent was interpreted as cowardice. Commanders who proposed retreats were sidelined or sent to secondary fronts. The principle of absolute obedience annulled initiative. In 1943, General Tojo, who concentrated political and military power, rejected any negotiation plans. Cabinet documents record phrases like, "Defeat does not exist for the Japanese spirit." This conviction closed off any possibility of adjustment when the war was already lost. Suicidal attacks were the most visible consequence of this rigidity. In late 1944, Admiral Onishi proposed the formation of kamikaze units as the only way to compensate for material inferiority. Many pilots barely knew how to fly. Of the thousands trained for these missions, most never reached their target, but the command considered that result acceptable. On land, the mentality was the same. In Okinawa, officers ordered frontal attacks on impossible positions. Exhausted troops charged without support, convinced that dying fighting was more honorable than surrendering. Medical documents from the army revealed that a significant portion of the casualties in the final days were self-inflicted. The command system prevented any corrections. The hierarchies functioned as closed circles where decisions were made by consensus and no one dared to contradict the superior. Tactical errors were attributed to fate or lack of faith, never to planning failures. The war was defined as a spiritual path, not as a problem of resources or technology. In the general staff, resistance to any change was total. Even when intelligence reports showed the extent of the losses, the generals insisted on continuing. In 1945, when the Allies already dominated the Pacific, they still spoke of a decisive battle in the archipelago. The final orders reflected this mentality to the extreme. In the months before surrender, the High Command issued directives ordering the destruction of anything useful to the enemy and the elimination of prisoners. Thousands of captives were executed following these instructions. Documents recovered after the war included the slogan, "Those who cannot fight should die fulfilling their duty." Within the government, there were isolated attempts to stop this spiral. Some ministers proposed negotiations, but the military pressure nullified any civilian initiative. The idea that the people must share the emperor's fate was imposed as dogma. Doctrinal rigidity also prevented learning from the enemy. Japan knew the importance of radar, modern logistics, and air coordination, but its commanders considered them secondary to the warrior spirit. Resources were allocated to desperate projects like suicide weapons, while practical solutions were ignored. The country's mental structure made an early surrender impossible. Every defeat was interpreted as a moral trial. Thus, the army continued fighting even when material means had already been exhausted. The war had become an act of collective faith, sustained by a system that confused obedience with virtue and sacrifice with victory. Atomic bomb, the definitive breakdown of the Japanese command. In 1944, the sky over Japan became a war front. Sea routes were blocked, the industry barely survived, and the Allied command decided to directly attack the heart of the country from the air. The archipelago became a planned destruction zone. The first B-29 bomber raids were limited and ineffective. From high altitudes, the bombs missed their industrial targets due to stratospheric winds. The factories continued to operate, and the strategy was not yielding results. Faced with this failure, the Allied planners changed their approach. The goal was no longer to destroy specific facilities, but to set entire cities on fire. In the spring of 1945, General Curtis LeMay took command of the air offensive and transformed the campaign. He ordered nighttime raids at low altitudes, without tight formations, using napalm and phosphorus bombs. Japan, with its cities mostly built of wood and paper, became the perfect fuel. The new tactic was first applied on the night of March 9, 1945. Over 300 B-29 bombers took off from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian and dropped over 1,600 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The fire spread uncontrollably. Canals boiled, streets were covered in flames, and the air became unbreathable. More than 80,000 people died in a single night, and 40 square kilometers were reduced to ashes. By dawn, the capital was a continuous black stain. After Tokyo, the same pattern repeated itself across the country. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of medium-sized cities were systematically set on fire. In just a few months, more than half of Japan's industrial capacity had been destroyed. By June 1945, 66 cities had been attacked, and 30 of them were devastated, with more than 50% of their area destroyed. The impact was immediate. Factories that survived the fires ceased to operate due to a lack of power, materials, or labor. Millions of people were left homeless. Aircraft production fell by almost 90% and metallurgy by more than 70%. Hospitals burned down along with residential areas, and basic services collapsed. In many cities, there was no water, electricity, or medical care. The psychological effect was devastating. After each raid, there was absolute silence, broken only by the crackling of the flames. Entire families vanished without a trace. Shelters filled with smoke and became deadly traps. The population lived in a constant cycle of sirens, alarms, and destruction. By the summer of 1945, nearly 8 million people were homeless. By mid-1945, Japan was already a nation in ruins. 40% of the urban area had disappeared under the flames. The cities that had symbolized the empire's modernity were landscapes of ash and molten metal. However, the government had not yet decided to surrender. On August 6, 1945, that situation changed irreversibly. At 8:15 in the morning, a B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion destroyed the city in seconds. More than 70,000 people died instantly. The hospitals disappeared, communications were cut off, and the survivors began to die days later from the effects of radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Half of the city was destroyed and more than 40,000 people died in an instant. The Japanese government was paralyzed. No one knew how many more bombs could fall or how to defend against them. While Tokyo tried to comprehend the scope of the new weapon, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive in Manchuria. More than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers advanced from various fronts and overwhelmed the Kwantung Army, which lacked fuel, modern weapons, and maneuvering capacity. The defenses collapsed almost without resistance. The Soviet entry, combined with the impact of the atomic bombs, nullified the last strategy still contemplated by the Japanese leadership: to buy time to negotiate a way out. The blow was both military and political. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the High Command had no arguments left to justify continuing the conflict. The cabinet split between those who insisted on resisting and those who realized that prolonging the war would only lead to the complete destruction of the country. Although some isolated fighting continued for days, the central power had collapsed. Japan had received the final blows in less than 10 days. Total aerial destruction, atomic bombs, and the Soviet entry into the war. Without resources, without an operational army, and with no political margin, the empire surrendered. After the surrender, the country came under the occupation authority led by General MacArthur, who disarmed Japan, dissolved its imperial structure, and replaced the old government with an administration controlled from Tokyo. The first months were marked by hunger and desolation. The destroyed cities barely offered shelter, and the population survived on minimal rations. In the United States, the interpretation of the end of the war quickly solidified. More than 80% of the population approved of the use of atomic bombs, considering that they had prevented an invasion with enormous casualties. For the millions of American soldiers waiting for orders in the Pacific, Japan's surrender meant the end of a campaign that promised hundreds of thousands of dead. Within Japan, the reasons for the surrender remained a subject of debate. The military had relied on the Ketsugo strategy, which envisioned a final battle on the main islands. The bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki destroyed that expectation. For the first time, the High Command understood that an invasion might never come. The war could end from the air. The impact was political and moral. Emperor Hirohito, who had supported resistance until then, recognized that continuing the fight would mean the extinction of the nation. On August 14th, he communicated his decision to the Supreme Council. He argued that the armed forces were not prepared to withstand another offensive and that the population could not endure more bombings. On August 15th, he spoke to the nation by radio. His message mentioned the new and cruel bomb, whose destructive power was incalculable. He did not mention the Soviet Union, although its offensive in Manchuria had neutralized the Kwantung Army in a few days. For the Japanese commanders, the atomic bombs offered an explanation that preserved part of their honor: to accept defeat before science, not before a spiritually superior enemy. In the months that followed, trials and testimonies confirmed this version. Officials like Secretary Sakomizu declared that the surrender was attributed to the bomb to avoid blaming the military. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri, Japan signed its capitulation before General MacArthur. The war was officially over, but the country was reduced to rubble. 15 million people homeless and over 300,000 dead from air raids. What had started as an imperial project ended as a warning carved in ruins.